Welcome to the next our series of online lectures for modern Latin American history. Today we are going to expand on something we talked about in class, and that is the notion of progress. And we're going to do this by looking at a specific example of progress in Mexican history. This is an era known as the Porfiriato, which lasts from 1876 until 1910. So if you have any questions or things that don't make sense following at the end of this lecture, please feel free to contact me, either through email, stop by my office during my office hours, or of course you can always raise these questions during class. That said, let's get started. In class, we've already discussed this notion called progress. To most of us, progress is a positive word. It means moving forward. It means a better life, a better world. But when we study the history of Latin America, progress has a different meaning. Specifically, it means rapid economic change. This change began in the middle of the 19th century and continued into the 20th century. Moreover, the specifics of progress included the embrace of the Industrial Revolution and its emphasis on the efficient production of goods. It also meant the construction of railroads that could connect the region's most rural areas to its cities. It also meant the consolidation of agricultural lands into large farms for the production of things like coffee, chocolate, bananas, and rubber. All of these things would be produced not for local consumption, but for export to an international market. I think most of us would look upon these things as an improvement. However, progress did have its downside, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Well, now that we know what progress means, let's look at a good example of progress in Latin American history. In 1876, the mestizo military hero, a man by the name of Porfirio Diaz, was elected president of Mexico for the first time. For the most part, he will retain power for the next 34 years. Diaz will transform Mexico. One way he did this was by centralizing power into his own hands. The local leaders that he appointed were completely dependent upon him for their positions. If they were loyal, they were rewarded. If they challenged him or his policies, they would be replaced. Diaz also managed to maintain power by bringing together an interesting alliance of powerful groups in Mexico. Among his allies was the Roman Catholic Church, the army, foreign investors, and the elite landowners of Mexico. In this way, one might say he governed in the tradition of a caudillo. So make sure you remember what a caudillo is. Make sure you understand how caudillos ruled. Diaz has many of the qualities of a caudillo. So think about that. Diaz was also a proponent of progress for Mexico. Under his rule, Mexico will make remarkable economic progress. Diaz's idea was to promote foreign investment by creating political stability in Mexico. It worked. Foreign investment poured into Mexico under his rule, and that investment will lead to an increase in mining, agriculture, and manufacturing across the country. It will also lead to the construction of railroads. Under his reign, railroad mileage will grow from about 400 miles to about 15,000 miles of track by the time he leaves office. So, in many respects, Diaz is really the poster child for progress. He's promoting industrial growth, he's promoting the growth of railroads, and so on and so on. The result was also the growth of a new middle class in Mexico. Now, the term middle class refers to a class of citizens who generally work in professional jobs. These individuals, though not wealthy, not the elites in Mexican society, did have enough money after they had paid for their housing and their food and their clothing to pay for some luxuries. For example, they might be able to afford some nicer clothing. They might be able to afford some better furniture. They might be able to afford some extra food and things like that. They're not simply living hand to mouth. They're not living paycheck to paycheck. They have a little left over for some of the luxuries in life. That's what is meant by the term middle class. And under Diaz's rule, the middle class will expand. But the Porfiriato, as the 34 years of Diaz's rule in Mexico, will have its downside. One was the foreign control of resources. Remember, one of Diaz's keys, one of his ideas for funding, for producing industrialization, for building railroads, for really building up the economic base of Mexico, had been to encourage foreign companies and foreign investors to invest in these things in Mexico. The problem was, I should say this, it worked. It worked beautifully. But there was a problem. The problem was that while foreign investment did stimulate economic growth, it also meant that the greatest beneficiaries of that growth were foreign investors and foreign companies. Let's look at these numbers because they show the extent of that investment. By 1910, in other words, by the end of Diaz's rule, 75% of all mines within Mexico were owned by foreign companies or foreign investors. 97% of all rubber resources were in the hands of foreigners. And 90% of Mexico's oil was under the control of foreigners. Now, Mexico's greatest investors were companies from the United States. But there was also significant investment from Great Britain and from France. In addition to taking much of the profit from Mexico's resource wealth, this situation also meant that foreigners could exercise a great deal of influence over the Mexican economy and over its government. This is going to come into play later. Now let me explain that one more time. Because, for example, foreign companies from the United States or from Great Britain or from France controlled 75% of the mines, 97% of the rubber resources, 97% of the oil. That was more than simply investment. It meant more than simply that the profits from these industries left the Mexican country. In other words, it also meant that these companies had a great deal of control over Mexico's economy, and through that control of their economy, they could exercise control over Mexico's leaders, its political system as well. That's going to be an important idea, so hang on to it. Now, another group that benefited from the Porfiriato were the wealthy landowning class. I should say was the wealthy landowning class, I'm sorry. As railroads were built to Mexico's furthest regions, these wealthy landowners began to see that they could make huge profits in commercial agriculture. They took advantage of new laws to claim control of most of Mexico's fertile agricultural lands. Now, of course, there was a loser in this battle for the land. Much of the land that had been farmed by Mexico's indigenous and mestizo populations for centuries. I should say, most of this land had been farmed by Mexico's indigenous and mestizo populations for centuries. And with their land lost, they were now forced to seek work on the new commercial farms. They now took on a new title. They became known as campesinos. Campesinos were essentially peasants. They were those who worked for others. So once again, let me just explain this. They went from being independent farmers who for centuries had farmed their own land. They had grown their own food. They had grown their own crops. They had essentially lived independently. Once commercial agriculture comes in, once Diaz encourages the growth of these large-scale farms for commercial agriculture, much of the land that goes into these commercial farms will come from the poor, indigenous, and mestizo communities. And these folks who had been independent for centuries now have no choice but to seek their livelihood as peasants or campesinos who are working on these large-scale commercial farms. The work on these farms was hard and the hours were long. Moreover, most campesinos found it very hard to support themselves and their families. At the same time as Mexico grew more prosperous, it did not grow more democratic. And this is going to be another problem facing Mexico during the Porfiriato. Voting rights were restricted only to the elites in Mexico. Moreover, everyone knew that when elections were held, they knew who was going to win. This began to anger members of Mexico's new middle class, as well as its growing group of liberals. By the time the 20th century dawns, Mexico will be ripe for revolution. And by the time this revolution is done, more than 1 million people will be dead, and Mexico will be in chaos once again. We'll continue this story in a future class. Thank you for listening.